you leave me feeling dirty 'cause you can't understand. We're going down. Feeling too. Oh, Jonah, we're going down. You know that we're doomed, my dear. We're slow dancing in a burning room. Go cry about it, why don't you? Go on and cry about it, why don't you? Go on and cry about it, why don't you? Jonah's crying. My dear, we're slow dancing in a burning room. Don't you think we ought to know by now? Don't you think we should have learned somehow? Don't you think we ought to know by now? Don't you think we should have learned somehow? Don't you think we ought to know by now? Don't you think we should have learned somehow? Don't you think we ought to know by now? Don't you think we should have learned somehow?
That'll give us, we'll fade out. It'll be fun to fade out a little guitar solo and a little barking.
Who is it?
What? Who could it possibly be?
What is so important?
I think it's because those kids.
Blinky. Red. Okay. Ready? 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. Hello all. Welcome back. If this is your first time, you should go look at some of the other cool stuff that we've already done. My name is Chris Haden. I'm the pastor at Kindred UMC.
Hey, I'm Courtney Young. I'm the Director of Community Engagement at Kindred UMC.
I'm Preston. I'm not a fan of boots.
For you or on other people?
Oh, just me.
Okay, all right.
They're fine.
Yeah.
You're going to have to get some boots for Colorado.
I'm good.
Fair warning, the dog has been needy. You probably heard him barking in the opening song. He's an old boy, and it's hard to just get up every morning, I guess, for him.
Woo!
You're antagonizing him. So we are picking back up with our series on first families through the book of Genesis, and today we're going to be talking about Noah and the flood. Before we get started, I know it's been a couple weeks since we talked about first family stuff. Can you remember from Cain and Abel? Do we have any follow-ups that we need to address from Cain and Abel?
No, not for me at least.
Deep or shallow?
Well,
Because coming
deep if we can do it in like 10 minutes or less.
Oh, okay. Coming from a family of 5 children, so 4 of my sisters and me, a mutual respect among siblings was a very big underlying thing. Like, first we have mutual, because we have an army. But
well, so
But I see what you're saying though, because
Yeah.
that's how
Well,
I
yes,
have
you
3
come
siblings,
from-
so it was the same way.
yeah,
that I don't say that flippantly, because it can go terribly wrong.
right.
Don't mistake, there's very real danger there of actual harm when brother and brother, to refer to the story, but I would say more broadly neighbor. Like when the people you share your life with or the people who are near you, when you don't take that
Nearest
mutual
you.
respect responsibly,
Yeah.
then it really goes dangerously.
Yeah,
and that's
so-
kind of the like the negative end, the moral of that story.
So it plays off of this this almost parenting aspect too, of they're out in the field doing their own thing. Hopefully Adam and Eve are back somewhere else or doing their whatever, but keeping some kind of watch over, which was never really
it's never
touched
It's
on.
never really clear, but culturally we can assume they're adults.
Yeah.
Cain and Abel were adults.
Sure.
Yeah.
So
At least at that point in the
yeah,
story.
they're not 8-year-old kids
Right.
hopefully moving around livestock.
Well, they
But-
might be like
It could be
13-year-olds.
adults in that, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But the point I'm making is that mutual respect needs to be established first. And because it wasn't, or because whatever literary term you want to use, Cain wasn't feeling as equal, depending on his work. Something that,
Right. For arbitrary reasons.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and I think that's an important takeaway from the Cain and Abel story. It's not that Cain was doing bad and Abel was doing good. It's arbitrary. Cain's offering was rejected and Abel's was accepted for not really a great reason, as far as we can tell. And that is one of the harsh truths of being alive and being human, being aware and conscious, you know? Like Jonah, the dog, doesn't have to really worry about those things. Because and this is we're going to talk about Noah, and one of the funny things about Noah is like the idea of sinful animals. Like all these, and like Eddie Izzard does a great bit where he talks about, what about all the ducks? Like, we just float up here now. So there must be all these really bastard ducks out there because they didn't get wiped out during the flood. All the bad ones stayed around, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So like this idea of sinful animals, like it actually, when you really just give it a little bit of thought, sinful animals doesn't really make a lot of sense because they only are what they are. Like sin requires this kind of self-conscious, self-awareness, ability to choose, knowledge between good and evil, which is where it goes back to the Adam and Eve.
Touched on, great tie-in. And not to go into Noah yet, but I've got the base now, and now my overlay is coming from a baseline of love and respect for your other, which is your siblings growing up and close friends growing up. That ties into a workplace environment. We're in a capitalistic society. So going through a process of, wow, I thought I put this much work in, and someone else got the promotion that I wanted. Mm-hmm. And me coming from, I don't see what work they do and maybe I don't understand. You come from, I know the work I did and will never understand that, and now I'm chided. Now I'm the underdog here because
and there's two choices. Well,
Correct.
there's more than two choices, but broadly speaking, there's kind of like two categories of choices. One is I accept responsibility. Or combined with I accept the arbitrary unfairness of the world,
Right.
You know, because sometimes it is that like I got looked over because of my gender, or I got looked over because of predetermined things that are out of my control. Sometimes that is the case.
And I think it's a misconstrued, overlooked part of the story that's usually, don't kill your damn brother or you're going to walk the earth.
Well, I think even more base than that, when those things happen, like let's say you're pretty sure you got overlooked because of something out of your control that's arbitrary. If you harbor resentment and cultivate a story of blame, the place it leads to is isolation and death. If instead you cultivate personal responsibility, and neither are perfect, neither are 100% accurate, you know, because there is arbitrariness and there is injustice in the world. But when you start to cultivate resentment and blame, it leads to destruction. Sin is crouching at your door. It longs to devour you. My shame is too great. I have to go away. I can't. Like, that's where it leads. That's the story of Cain and Abel. And the opposite is also true. When we start to begin to say, all right, well, maybe this is unfair. What can I do? How can I respond? Can I report this to somebody? Can I seek a better job? Can I, if I buckle down and work harder, will that result in better outcomes for me? Like, they're, again, neither are perfect, but the latter is much better for you and for everyone around you, you know? And like, that's the heart of, I think, Cain and Abel. You know, that one way leads to destruction, like in a very literal sense. And the other way actually leads to like vitality, you know, life. So I'm glad you brought it up, because that's a very good base to start from, because we ended Cain and Abel with on a like a down note, you know, like brother kills brother and is walking the earth in isolation now. And it leads into the story of Noah. Now, Noah actually happens over like several chapters, so I'm not going to read the chapters, and most people are generally aware of the broad strokes. So we'll go through the broad strokes of the actual flood story and talk a little bit about that, and then I want to pick up at the very end of the story after everything is kind of like cleared out. And Noah and God's response to that. We'll actually read that. But broadly speaking, God still sees that there is evil in human like nature. And that's a profoundly scary thing to think about, that most people don't like to think about. And so the hardest part about the Noah flood story is the truth that humankind and the human condition carries with it a darkness that is violent and petty and evil and selfish and like all of the like. And so the reason I bring that up is because most of us don't think of ourselves that way. Like most Christians in the church, and myself included, when we read, for example, when we read like about the crucifixion of Jesus, we never put ourselves in the place of the Pharisees. We always put ourselves in the place of like the disciples who would stand by him forever. And that's just probably not true.
If anything, we're the most relatable to
Seriously.
Peter.
Yeah.
I think Peter is people. I think Peter is the human existence.
I think...
I will stand by you till the day you die, except...
Yeah, except when it really matters.
Right.
You know?
And
yeah.
then I crumble.
Yeah, and then it's like, oh no, I didn't think this was possible. I
I'm
didn't
only
think it
saying
would go this way.
And I'm only saying it because I would like to think it's not possible and we're going to not ever get there.
So I want to lift up a study that was done post-World War II. It's a psychological, I can't remember the actual original publisher, the person who actually conducted and wrote the study. But you probably have heard it before, people out there in cyberland. So bear with me, I'm just going to retell it briefly. The whole setup of the study is a subject is brought in. They're the person that's being examined. They're the person who's the subject of the study. And a person in a lab coat with a clipboard sits them down in front of a machine and tells them that their task is going to be to ask questions to somebody who's on the other side of like a screen. Oh. They can hear the person.
I think I know what this is.
Yeah, you've probably heard this at some point. Mm-hmm. Everybody in college is probably like, it's a groundbreaking study. So, long story short, the person is tasked with asking the other person questions, and if they get them right, we move on to the next question. If they get them wrong, they're supposed to flip a switch that gives them an electrical shock. The machine is labeled as increasingly strong electrical shocks.
Milgram
Milgram
experiment is what it's called.
So, and then the last like two on the machine are labeled like lethal, do not use. This, like, it's clear with the symbology and the words, this will kill someone. Do not do this. And so the person begins very simply with reading out the question to the person on the other side. The other person gets the answer wrong, and then they go, okay, well, here it comes, and they give them a little zap, a little shock. And the person goes, oh, ow, you know. And then, of course, as the experiment continues, it gets increasingly worse. And the person on the other side, because they can hear each other, the person on the other side is starting to like, ow, ooh, no, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to do this. And so they ask the question, and the person's like, no, I'm done. Let me out. I don't want to do this. This hurts. And the person who is administering the shocks starts to check in, typically, with the lab coat guy. And the lab coat guy has one response, which is, please continue, it's for science, or something like that. And so he's got a clipboard and a lab coat, and he says, please continue, it's for science. And so then the experiment was designed to see how far people will go. Now, of course, the catch of it all is that the person on the other side is not being shocked at all. They're paid actors. So no one's being harmed at all. The shocking is not real. But the person who's administering the shocks does believe that they are causing harm to someone. And the question, the whole purpose of the experiment was to discover what is it about German people post-World War II that is so inherently evil. And so they started with this experiment to see how far German people would go versus the rest of the world, the other ethnicities. And of course, the shocking truth is that almost everyone goes all the way to fatal, believing that they have killed someone. And you're not really allowed to reproduce the study anymore because of the trauma that the subjects incurred upon themselves with the self-knowledge that they, with very minimal prompting, just some guy in a lab coat and a clipboard saying, please continue, that they could flip a switch and kill someone at that little bit of a prompting. And that truth, and it is true, it's measurably true, that truth was traumatic and devastating for a lot of people that were in the study. And only very rarely did people stop before they killed someone. That's not how we like to think of ourselves. I mean, we like to picture ourselves as the disciples who would follow through, the people who would stand up to the experimenter and say, no, I won't do it, it's unethical, I'll never harm someone knowingly. But the truth is, no, you absolutely will. You absolutely will. That's the beginning of the flood story. Everyone carries a shadow, a remnant of sadism, sadistic, harmful nature inside of them. And ignore it at your peril. Ignore it at your peril. It will destroy you. It is crouching at your door, and its desire is for you, to have you. And you must master it. And before you can master it, you have to see it. You have to acknowledge it and admit it. So, picking up after the Cain and Abel story, that's where we're left with all of humanity. And then God's response to that is, I'm going to kill everything. I regret creating humanity. I'm going to wipe all life out with a great flood. Now, a couple of cultural things. One, because we have to zoom out before we can understand, because that sounds like a jerk God, again. And what's so good about this good news? So we have to zoom out. First of all, for those of you who don't know, a type of flood story exists in basically every major ancient culture. Native Americans who had zero contact with Israelites have a flood story. Several Native American cultures have a flood story. Africa, several tribes in Africa have flood stories. A lot of different people groups in Mesopotamia have flood stories. And in fact, a lot of people theorize that this flood story from Noah is actually based on Gilgamesh, which also has a flood story. And Gilgamesh has a lot of ties to the Adam and Eve story, the garden, the snake, a lot of similar imagery. And there's a flood story in Gilgamesh, similar idea, where the gods want to just wipe out all life on Earth. And somebody has to build a boat to save humanity, So this is a story that pervades lots and lots of human cultures. Now, the question is like, why? Like was there an actual great flood? Probably not. Like probably the idea that the whole world flooded and that people still survived, like that's so highly unlikely that can't be it. So we're forced to kind of like come up with other theories, right? So here's one of the things that I think is really interesting. Way back in Genesis 1, it says that God parted the waters. And I always read that as a kid thinking that God like parted the waters to create land. Like all right, here's like laterally. Here's that's going to be the Pacific, that's going to be the Atlantic, and here's going to be the continent of America. But that's not at all what it was. The ancient people, they looked up at the blue sky where rain comes, and they were like, water. Like water's up there, obviously, because that's where the water comes from. And look, it's blue. Like just we look down and we see blue water. We look up and we see blue water. So they actually believed that when parted the waters, it was like vertically parted the waters, so that there's what they called a firmament that protected the land that we live on from the water that's above us. And every time it rained, and especially if you lived near a river and you like went through like monsoon season or whatever, when you rain and the river starts expanding and expanding and expanding, and all of a sudden it's at your front door, the idea that the firmament could be failing and that the waters could come crashing down and kill everyone is actually like a really reasonable dread that most people carried with them. And floods would come in seasonally and literally decimate places. Like you had to be near the river to live, particularly in Mesopotamia. Like you're in a dry desert place. We need the water. We have to be close to it. And every once in a while it kills us. Like that's a terrifying existence. That's probably the root of this flood story. It's like dealing with the existential dread. And again, we're the only animals on the planet that know that we die one day, And so this is trying to make sense of what is humanity's place and what is God's place in, like, does God love us? Does God hate us? Does God care about us? Or is God like completely not interested in us? These are the questions that are related to the flood and flooding. So the idea that people would read the story and God would be like, that's it, I've had it with humanity, I'm flooding everyone. People would go like, yeah, that sounds like a God, right? That's how gods do. We've heard these stories before. This is what we expect the God to do. What's surprising, however, is that somebody is actually tasked with saving creation. That this God actually reaches out to somebody and tasks them with saving creation. And then as the story goes, this guy Noah, who's found favor with God, builds an ark. He puts two pairs, or a pair of every animal, although that's not entirely true. There's 7 pairs of clean animals, which will come into focus later. So clean animals for like sacrificing and eating, there's 7 pairs of those. And then just a pair of every unclean animal. And then the family of Noah and their wives, because it's a patriarchal society. So when they say family, they just meant Noah and his sons. And oh, by the way, you can bring your wives. That was kind of like part of the culture at the time. And so the flood comes, everything gets washed away. They say typically it's 40 days. No, it floods for 40 days, and then they stay afloat for much, much, much longer until the waters can actually recede.
Well, we've touched on this before, too, on hyperbole in ancient culture or ancient writing, too, of the 40 days being a running trope of 40 days not necessarily
it's like a season.
Meaning one after 39.
Right.
It just means this amount of time over a month or over whatever.
Yeah, it's almost like saying a fortnight.
Yeah.
Or something
for a
like
long
that.
time.
Yeah, right. So the ark ends up on a mountaintop while the waters are still receding. Eventually, after sending out a raven and then a dove, and then sending that same dove out until it doesn't come back, then they learn, okay, it's safe, and we leave. Okay, so God has flooded the entire world, killed everyone, which is kind of like, again, it makes God sound like a jerk, But if you're following the overarching narrative, the problem of the story of Genesis is God creates everything and says it's good. God creates humankind in God's own image and calls it very good. Then humans achieve self-consciousness and awareness of good and evil and the ability to choose. They're no longer Jonahs. They're no longer dogs that are just present. Like a dog can't really make an evil choice. Like dogs chase squirrels. It's not because they hate squirrels. It's because they're dogs and they chase squirrels, Like I remember one time when Jonah actually finally caught a squirrel. And it was like a little horrifying, but it's also like, well, yeah, that's what he's still a good boy. He's still Jonah, People can consciously choose malice and hatred and resentment. People can choose revenge. People can hold grudges. There is something unique about the human consciousness that we don't quite see in other animals. And the problem of Genesis is that. So what are the solutions to the evil that lurks inside the hearts of humanity? One potential solution that we have to address, if we believe in a God and we can see the horrifying truth of the darkness that exists in humanity, then one solution we have to consider is why doesn't God just kill humanity? And especially if you live in this world where there's rains and a firmament and the rivers flood and you don't know why and you don't understand, you attribute all this to God's will, the God must be angry with us. The question then comes, how in the world do we navigate the horrors of this? Can we possibly have an okay relationship with creation, knowing that there is darkness inside of us? And that's where the end of the story I want to pick up. So Genesis chapter 8, verse 20 through 22. This is after the flood, after they've left the ark. Then Noah built an altar to Yahweh and took of every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. That's why it's important to know that there were 7 pairs. Because after pulling the animals off the ark, he immediately sacrifices some of them. Oh, well, there goes the species. No, the storyteller is kind of allowing for that, So Noah sacrifices offerings on the altar. And when Yahweh smelled the pleasing odor, Yahweh said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of human heart is evil from youth. Nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, shall not cease. Now that sounds a little crazy, especially for people who have the internet and live in houses. But the fact that this particular flood story, which is in contrast to most other cultures' flood stories, this particular flood story ends with Noah showing gratitude and God responding with a promise of security. You don't have to worry about that. And that is actually remarkably good news. It was a revolutionary, progressive idea that, hey, you don't have to, and again, one of the problems that Genesis is dealing with is this sacrifice culture, this constantly self-flatulating kind of instinct from people who are dealing with a God like that. And a lot of the work of the book of Genesis is trying to get people into a place where they get, it brings up the problem like a flood. I'm afraid that God's going to just get mad and destroy me. Hey, yeah, okay. Well, there was one time where God got mad and destroyed everyone. But then at the end of that, Noah, the only survivor, made some sacrifices to God, and then God made this promise. And then later it goes on to establish a rainbow, which is also a brilliant narrative mechanism. Every time it rains, when you see a rainbow, you don't have to worry, which is just about every time it rains. It's somebody trying to address the problem of existential dread. Am I okay? Does God care about me? Does God love me or does God hate me? And the message from Noah's Ark is, no, God actually loves you. despite having very good reasons not to, because we all have darkness, we are all imperfect, God actually really loves you and promises not to just come down and destroy you and squish you under the boot, you know? So let me stop there before we kind of go into other things. Thoughts, questions, comments, concerns?
So we're talking psych before. A big point in psych is to learn the difference between correlation and causation. So I have a cold.
Some things happen at the same time. That doesn't mean they're causing each other.
Correct. I have a cold and sneeze on someone's face. 2 days later, they have the same cold I have. Same viral RNA, whatever it is, in viruses. Taking this and tweaking it to this story, it's so weird to think like this. It's very atheistic and like people-y thinking. If Genesis is all stemming from this, you need to sacrifice because that's how things get good. It's hard to put.
That was the context of culture.
So I'm
at the
just
time,
trying to say the words before I say other words after them. It's like it's correlative thinking. It's because it's most likely because one fat dude goes, I burnt this pure white, probably not. I burnt this animal, and right when that happened, the rain stopped. And I think I did it. But there's no way it's my doing, and I have to convince everyone else that this is how it works. And if not, we're all going to die.
It's also, so the thing that differentiates us from the rest of animals is our ability to make meaning. Like that, the human brain evolved over millions of years to see categories, make meaning out of things, to draw conclusions that are not obviously inherently true, but are instead inferred, you know? And so like it's simultaneously our biggest strength, and it has all kinds of like really horrifying side effects. And one of them is child sacrifice. One of them is like quite literally human, like people would conquer other tribes so that they would have human sacrifices to keep the gods at bay, to keep people alive at the hands of the gods. So they're literally killing that which is the other. And these are all symptoms and side effects of the categorical nature of our ability to like process and categorize, you know?
It's almost this call to piety type of like call to duty type of thing, but instead of duty, it's duty to piety, of sacrificing to something else bigger than you for the rest. But it's so...
Except I'm not going to sacrifice for me. I'm going to go kill them and sacrifice them.
For this side,
right? And that's kind of like
rooted in them versus us.
And so this is like, again, we can't think of the writer of Genesis or the editor of Genesis probably multiple editors, like many writers, multiple editors. Whoever put Genesis together, we cannot mistake ourselves by treating them like a primitive, ignorant person. No, they're Shakespeare, they're Dostoevsky, they're whoever did this is a brilliant philosophical thinker who saw where things were going on a much broader scale than anyone else seemed to, and then put together this book and this narrative and began to tell a different story so that people could orient themselves in a better, healthier way. And they did it, the reason it survived for so long is because it actually applies to every human being across contexts. Like the reason it survived for thousands and thousands of years is because it still holds true today. And like, I know it's weird because most of our people are like in their 20s. And so the idea of existential dread is not really a thing. Like,
yeah, it's not really something I deal with on a day-to-day basis yet.
But you do. And here's how most people do. Most people in their 20s do. Most people in their 20s have some form of anxiety around, is what I'm doing meaningful? Does it matter?
Yeah.
That necessarily is rooted in, I only have a certain amount of time.
Makes sense.
You know what I mean? Like
No.
if we had this ongoing like
I don't have time.
if we had this ongoing eternal life for real, then what you're doing now kind of doesn't matter that much because you have an infinite resource.
Right.
Well, even to tie this into your other podcast, Kindred Spirits, which...
An Enneagram podcast on Apple, iTunes, Spotify, and everywhere else you can get your
Look at you
podcasts.
plugging the podcast.
I might not believe as much as some people do in the Enneagram, but this speaks to it, saying if we were to find meaning in something, a motivation is a type of meaning. It's a...
Oh, yeah.
I want, in like the simplest terms, from A to B, your motivation, where is it going from A to B?
Right.
And when you're at B...
Knowing specifically for you what motivates you
Yeah.
starts to get at the heart of trying to address some of this, like, it may not like fit into existential dread, but the like meaning making, trying to do something with your life, trying to find relationships that matter. I would say probably the biggest thing that I hear from people that we minister to has something to do around dating and like the flippantness of dating right now. I'm not singling you out.
You didn't smile first.
Everyone does.
That's fine.
Like everyone, like particularly because what we've done with the like just dating in general and kind of modern times is we've subjugated it to a series of checkboxes, and that, like any dating apps are like that's what they're designed to do, and we're kind of like handing it over to an algorithm, and and then also like trying to take as much responsibility and stake out of it simultaneously too. Like, God, if I could just go get laid and not have to deal with any of this other stuff, then I'd be happy. Or at least that's what we think, Like, and it doesn't work that way.
Right.
And again, all of this is actually rooted in existential dread. All of it, even though you don't consciously connect it to like, oh, I die one day, subconsciously we're all aware that our time is like,
Limited.
yeah, it's like sand through our fingers, man. Like it will go away one day. And so every major religion and any good God has to deal with the existential dread. And Genesis has a lot more to say about that. And the whole Bible, of course, has a lot more to say about that. But for this story, the starting place of that, at the very least, is listen, I'm not gonna just arbitrarily wipe everyone out. You don't have to live in fear of that. God saying to humanity, believe it or not, I'm actually for you. Which is like, that has to be the starting point of any relationship. Mm-hmm. Believe it or not, I'm actually for you. And if you'll walk with me a ways, I can demonstrate it.
And in the storytelling vein too, it's pretty curious to think of the Gilgamesh story, and somebody in mythology, correct me if I'm wrong, but the story was, since there were many gods, and humans were starting to kind of come up now, and Gilgamesh was at the head-ish, if not the head of humanity, almost the face, and most of the gods being jealous gods, which is kind of where that term comes from,
Mm-hmm.
of we don't want humanity to catch up to us and figure out that we're a bunch of piece of shits.
Yeah,
and don't care about anything.
Genesis 2.
So
Genesis 3 is like that's what God literally says to
Yep.
God's self.
Yeah, so instead of making fire like we usually do, let's make a flood and make it look wholesome and natural. Gilgamesh has some in with some god. I think it's his aunt or mom or something. He's of royalty, whatever.
You're right. Yeah.
And so they come out.
It's been a long time, but he's kind
Yeah.
of like a Hercules. He's like a demigod.
Yeah, so they come out, that one comes out and says, this is happening, this has been happening in our meetings, blah, 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 blah. You need to figure out some way to stay afloat, and whoever else you care about, get on the ship and stay there, and I'll hide you from their view, and then when it all goes away, you'll be alive. And
Which is very different from the pantheon of gods coming and saying, I don't want you to die.
Yeah.
Right.
So, if we're thinking in this vein, and to streamline it into one, going, I'm doing this because I'm angry, but you've shown or proven yourself, blah, blah. Here's the flood anyway. Please do this, and you can avoid it, and if not, then you're a dum-dum. But I imagine you, because you're like this, I trust you. Please do it this way, and because you've made, and then the whole story, I won't ever do it again, and blah, 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 blah. And I wrote this down like, it's almost sacrilege to say, but is God learning at this time as we are? And can we question that?
All right. So again, reiterating stuff I've said, Pat, in the past, in past episodes. It's important to read it like Shakespeare.
Right.
Because the God character in this story absolutely is. Like the God and the God character in the Old Testament constantly like has moments of like where God changes his mind. Like, because this story starts with, the old, I think it's the King James version, God repenteth himself of creating humanity. Like, he repents, which is like sin language in Judaism. Like, God acknowledges the creation of humanity as a sin that God commits and repents himself of the creation of, like, that's some stark, scary language if you really believe that this is the God who brings rain and flood and like devastation. Then it's like, oh shit, like he hates us. But that's also the starting place for most people in that era. Most people who read this story the first time it was written or told were already there. They were already terrified of the God that that controlled and created like rain and flood. So as the story goes on, that God character that starts in the place where everyone expects the gods to start, with like this flippant hatred of humanity, goes through a character arc. Joseph Campbell, take a drink, everyone. Everyone take a shot. Yes, Joseph Campbell.
We're waiting for it.
The hero's journey here is of the God character. God starts off hating humanity, sets out to do something about it. The reason he floods the earth is to solve the problem of human sin. After accomplishing everything he set out to do, like every good hero, realizes that it's not the answer. Changes his mind and learns a deeper truth that if we're ever going to have any hope of existence, if we're ever going to have any hope of anything good, you and I are going to have to find a way to get along. I promise that no matter what, I will never flood the earth and wipe out all living things. You can count on me. And like this desire of God that goes from like, all these sinful people to, these are my people and I will love them even though they are sinful. Now, I don't think that that's like, you know, like we have all this theology in Christianity that God is timeless and God is constant and God never changes. And yet the Bible says literally the opposite things.
Right.
But again, that's because our actual traditions, not the past 100 years of literalist bullshit, but our actual traditions have always understood that this is a narrative that's designed to get us at the character of God, which is pervasive and unchanging. And you know, and so the character of God in here goes through a change, but the only reason is so that we can get on board and begin to understand the nature of our true heavenly God, which is, I am for you. I know you fuck up. I know you have darkness inside of you. I know that you have resentment and bear grudges and have jealousy and can literally wish revenge and malice on other people. I know that those things exist in you. I know that if some guy with a clipboard tells you to kill someone for science, that you will do it. Like, I know those things about you. And I love you and I'm with you and let's make peace. Like, that's good news. That's really good news. And we can't go any further until we get that like fundamental building block established.
I think we keep dancing around this narrative point too, and not to look at it literally, but literarily, that this narrative point of these times is tied into that word OLD, old. And the Old Testament was this story, the rainbow coming up and the promise happening, as a story element of us needing to remember, again, repeating this. It's told over a bonfire. It's told
a brilliant
outside.
Narrative. Like, it's an amazing... So again, this is before like modern psychology, it's before the internet, it's before like pervasive understanding of human consciousness. And some writer had the brilliance to understand how people work so much that he's like, I'm going to base this in a persistent physical thing so that nobody forgets. Like it's genius. It's brilliant. The promise of God's faithfulness and love for us is inherent in the times that are most scary. So like I think of, so like Jonah, ever since Hurricane Irma came through, And it was like thundering and lightning and loud. And he, the dog, never had any problem with thunder or lightning or fireworks or anything until Hurricane Irma came through. And it terrified him. And now any time that there is thunder, he experiences existential dread. Like, and there's no, like, I try and try and try. And I pet him and I try, like, I'm trying, like, hey, it's okay, buddy, come here. And I put pillows on him and I, like, try to make him feel secure. And it's just kind of like nothing doing. He's just not smart enough to understand. Now imagine if I could somehow root a sense of security in the sound of thunder. Imagine if I could correlate in his brain that every time he hears thunder, he knows and experiences my love for him. That's what Noah's Ark is. Every time you see dread, every time you encounter fearful, horrifying truth in the world, think of me, think of my love for you, and know that I'm with you. Like, that's good fucking news. Like, that's gospel message right there. And that's the essence of the Noah's flood story. Any other things? That's about all I've got to say about it.
That's pretty case in point.
Yeah.
All right. Well, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Try to hit me just to hurt me, so you leave me feeling dirty, 'cause you can't understand.